Welcome to Excel magic trick number 1468. Hey, if you want to download this Excel file or the zipped folder with the text files we're going to use so you can follow along, click on the link below the video. Hey, we got to talk about Power Query, also known in Excel 2016 as Get and Transform, to see how to clean, transform, and import data for both pivot tables, Excel pivot tables, and Power Pivot, the data model, and the pivot tables we generate from the data model. Now, this example comes straight from my Highline Business 218 Advanced Excel class. And here's the thing. I already filmed this video and these three examples. But guess what? In the last year, Microsoft has completely changed the data ribbon tab. Now, it's even stranger than that. Some versions of Excel 2016 still have a data ribbon tab like this. And some other versions have a data ribbon tab like this. So what I want to do is this is the newer version of the data ribbon tab. And I want to film a video with the three examples using this ribbon tab. Now, here's the difference between these two. Notice, Get and Transform, that's Power Query. This is the older version where Get and Transform is on the right. And then we have the old legacy Get External Data. Now, we do not need Get External Data anymore, so Microsoft got rid of it because everything we need is in Power Query. So what they did is Get and Transform is on the left. The existing connections, that's connecting to some data source we've already connected to, which used to be in Get External Data, is now right here in Get and Transform Data. The Connections group is now its own new group, Queries and Connections. So Connections and Refresh All are down in this group. And then there's the Show Queries button. That's how we open up the task pane to show all of the queries we've made in Power Query. That button is now combined down here with Queries and Connection. All right, so we're going to use this ribbon tab. We can see up here, there is Get and Transform, Queries and Connection. Now, this video is an introduction to Power Query, and Power Query is simply amazing. There's three main things that it can do. It can clean your data, transform your data into a form that's exactly what you want. Most of the time, it's into a proper data set. And it can import data from almost any source. Now, our examples 1, 2, 3 will cover exactly 1, 2, 3, the three amazing things that Power Query can do. Our first example will be clean data and create an Excel PivotTable report. The second example, we'll take a cross-tabulated table and convert it into a proper data set. And then the third example, we'll take 1.2 million rows of data from different text files. We will import it into a new feature called Power Pivot. And Power Pivot is a new feature like Power Query. But what Power Pivot does is it allows us to import millions of rows of data, much more than we can hold in an Excel sheet. And then we'll create a Power Pivot report. All right, we're going to go to the sheet PQ, Get and Transform, to see our first example. Now, our first example is about cleaning data and then making a pivot table report. This is going to be our end result. Now, look what someone did. Someone created this data set, and look at that. Product, date, and region are all in a single cell. So we need to break it apart into 1, 2, 3 different columns. This is called cleaning the data. We need 1, 2, 3, 4 different columns in a proper data set, and then we can make a pivot table report. Now, anytime you have data in Excel, if you want to get it up into Power Query, we come up to Get and Transform and use the From Table button. But we have to convert our data into an Excel table before Power Query will even allow us to import it, clean it, and then create a proper data set. With a single cell in our data set, we go up to Insert. There's the Table button, or of course, I'm going to use Control-T. There's the Create Table dialog box. Definitely we have headers. Click OK. Now we definitely need to come up to the new Table Tools, Design Context-Sensitive Ribbons. Come over to Properties. And that is not a good name. We got to name this. Now, if we're creating a lot of tables, there is a keyboard that will jump you up to exactly where the new name should go. And the keyboard is Alt-JTA. Notice I'm highlighted, so I can simply, I called it Start Table Description Amount and Enter. Now that we have converted it to a table and named it, we can come up to the Data Ribbon tab, Get and Transform from Table button. Now look at this. This is a whole new window. This is the Power Query Editor window. And it is amazing what we can do cleaning, transforming, and importing data. Now over here, that's the name of our table from Excel. I want to give it a new name over here in Power Query. So I'm going to highlight this and call this Proper Sales Table and Enter. Now, it already created 2 steps. And as we do any cleaning and transforming over here, it will build a set of steps that we can look at or edit anytime we want. Now, step number 2 is change type. It added a text data type, and here it added an integer data type. Now, I don't want those data types because we're going to transform this column and change the data types anyway. So I'm going to come over here and click the red X. That is so cool. Now it has the icon for, I don't know what data type you are. It has the icon for text and integer together. All right, we need to clean this column. So I click on Description. And I need to split. And the characters that tell us where to split, the characters between product, date, and region, those are called a delimiter. Now, in this class, we're going to see lots of different delimiters, tab delimiters, comma delimiters. But look at what happened here. We have 3 characters, space, / space, and we have them in 2 locations. So we need to split this into 3 columns by the delimiter. No problem with Power Query. I click the column. Home, there's a split button. Transform, there's another split button. Both do exactly the same thing. Or we can right-click and come down to Split Column by Delimiter. When I click by Delimiter, it's going to ask us what the delimiter is. And look at this. I can come down to Custom. Now, if you've ever used the old feature in Excel, Text to Columns, we were not allowed to have more than 1 character as our delimiter. But no problem here, space, / space. Now look at this. We also have options of where to split it, which we didn't have in our old text to columns. We definitely want please split at each occurrence of the delimiter. Now I come over and click OK, and that is simply magic. We have split into 3 different columns. Notice also it added a data type. And for data types, you can click that icon and look at all the different data types. The icon for text is ABC. Over here, this description has the date icon, so that's the data type we want. ABC, we want that one here. But amount, I actually want to change it from I don't know. I'm going to click the drop-down to currency. Now, we could see 2 different steps over here. We're still going to need to rename these columns, so I'm going to simply double-click the column header, product, and enter. Double-click date and enter. Double-click region and enter. And I'm going to name this one too. This is actually sales and enter. We have our name. We have our steps. We can load our cleaned data, now transformed into a proper data set, by going to Home. Actually, I'm going to double-click, backspace, capital D, and then Enter. Now we go up to Home, Close, and we don't click up here on the Close and Load. We click the drop-down, and now we go to close and load to. I click that. And since we're in the latest updated version of Power Query, this is the Import Data dialog box. If you're in that earlier version, you'll actually see a larger white dialog box that says Load To. But the same buttons are in both dialog boxes. I'm going to select Table because I want to dump it back as a table. Later, we'll learn about only create a connection. And later, we'll learn about the data model. That's a synonym for Power Pivot. What we want to do is dump this on a new sheet. So I'm going to click OK. And just like that, we have our proper data set on a new sheet. I'm going to come down here and double click and call this PT1. That's going to be our pivot table 1. Now, if we ever made a mistake while doing Power Query, like we didn't name the columns correctly or something, you can simply come over. This is the Queries and Connection pane. It'll list all of the Power Query queries we have in this workbook. That relates to data. That's that button right there. If we needed to edit, we simply right-click Edit. Now, we're going to make our pivot table. I'm going to click in a single cell. And to create a pivot table, we go up to Insert, Pivot Table, or we're going to make so many pivot tables, we're always going to use the keyboard, Alt and V. Now, we want to put this on this existing sheet. Location, I'm going to try G1. Click OK. Now we can close this query pane. We can open it anytime we want. Now notice we have a date. And as we saw in video number 3 in Business 218 class, this is Excel 2016. And if we drag a date field down to rows, instantly it groups. That is so convenient. If I come over here and expand, there's the month, there's the day. Now I'm going to unexpand this, and I'm going to come over and drag date off. Now we have April and May in the row area. We want to drag product down below months, and then come over and use our plus to expand. Look at that. So for each month, we have a list of our products. Now let's drag sales down to values. I'm going to immediately come over and somewhere in the values area, right-click and point to number formatting. Number formatting will allow us to add number formatting to the actual sales field. I'm going to select currency. 2 is fine. Symbol is fine. Click OK. Now let's drag region over to columns. And look at that. We have a cross-tabulated table. Any intersecting cell is calculating the sum total based on 3 conditions. The region is south. The product is quad. The month is April. Now, something happened here that may not be happening in your version of Excel. When I created the pivot table, by default, it showed the field names. The earlier version of 2016 and then the earlier versions of Excel, we always had to do an extra step to show the field names. We always had to go up to Design, Report Layout, and Show in Tabular or Outline. In this particular version, you're allowed to set a default setting for a pivot table. And you would do that by File, over to Options, over to Data. There it is. Make changes to default layout for pivot tables. Edit default. And of course, I chose Show in Tabular. I'm going to click OK. Click OK. Now here's the amazing thing. We have April and May, right? This is a Excel table created by Power Query. If I go back to the original data source, which is PQ Get and Transform, there's our source data. Let's scroll over. This is so amazing. I've added a bunch of records here. This is just like if you were out there working and then you get sent by email the latest records. So I'm going to highlight the first 2 rows, Control-Shift down arrow, Control-C to copy, Control-Home to jump to cell A1. I'm going to click in one of the top cells and Control down arrow. Now I want to very carefully click exactly one row below and use Control V to paste. Now that was supposed to automatically incorporate this. I'm not quite sure what's happening with my Excel, but no problem. This is an Excel table. I come up to Table Tools Design, over to Properties where we named it, and click Resize Table. I'm going to click in the first two cells. There I see it. I'm going to use Control-Shift down arrow. Control-Shift down arrow. I had to do it twice to incorporate all the data. Click OK. Now, what's so beautiful about this, even though we had to take a couple steps to update this is a table object. If we go over to our sheet, PT1, and I'm actually going to show you. I'm going to open up Queries and Connection. There's our query. Now, I need to refresh the pivot table, which is connected to our Excel table from Power Query, which is actually connected to the Power Query, which is connected to the original table. Instead of refreshing each one individually, I'm going to try by going up to Data, Refresh All button. Now, this doesn't always work, but I'm going to click it and hope it does. I see it refreshing over there. It definitely refreshed 481 rows. When I click Control down arrow, I got them all right there. Control Home. It looks like that Refresh All button didn't work. I bet you that's a bug, but now I'm going to come over to the pivot table, right-click, refresh, the two-step refresh method, and instantly I have the latest records in my report. So Power Query took that original data, cleaned and transformed it. We created a pivot table. We added new data back over here. And just like that, even though we had to do a two-step refresh, everything's updated. Power Query is amazing. Now let's go look at our next example, PQ2. Now this is a straight transform our data. We need to go from, and I'm going to pull this task pane in. We need to go from a cross-tabulated table. That means that number right there is for Yanaki, Midwest. I need to go from this crosstab into a proper data set. That's just a picture so I could show you what our goal was. It's no problem with Power Query. Now, we still need to convert this to an Excel table to get it into Power Query. So Control-T, Enter. Alt-J-T-A, I'm going to rename this. I called it Start Cross-Tab T for Table, and Enter. Now, I click in a single cell, Data, Get and Transform, From Table Range. Here's the Query Editor. There's our cross-tab. The name, I'm going to change it. I called it Units because these are units. Proper Data T for Table, and Enter. It added two steps. I don't need this one at all, so I'm going to get rid of it. It's OK if you leave it there, too. Now, I want you to notice something, that this whole column is Yanaki. So there's a Yanaki for each one of the regions. But also, look at this, East. East is associated with each one of these products. So for any intersecting cell, I really need to create a record that has Midwest Aspen 74, Midwest Belen 47, Midwest Carlota 57. That means 3 columns, product, region, units. Now, these are the ones that we need to unpivot. Notice this looks like a pivot table that we created, and it's as if we need to unpivot this back into a proper data set. That's why they call the feature unpivot. Now, we could highlight all of these columns here and then use unpivot these columns, but it's much easier to select just the first column. And we can go over to Transform, and there's our drop down for unpivot columns, and we have unpivot columns and other columns. Or you can simply right-click, and I want to point to please unpivot the other columns. When I select that, 1, 2, 3 columns. There are all the Easts, all the products, and the units. Now we want to double click and name each column. Call this one region. I'm going to click the data type and go all the way down to text. Double click product and enter. Double click units and enter. Click the drop down, and this one we want whole number. After a while, you start to get used to what the icons mean, what data type they represent. Now, if we look over here, we have our name. There are all of our steps. And if you want to go back, notice I can click on each one of these steps and see exactly what I did. Now, our last step was change type. Now I want to close and load. Click the drop down to close and load to. I'm going to load it as a table, put it on this existing sheet, click the collapse button. I'm going to click right over to the side. There's the sheet name and P10. Click the uncollapse, click OK. And just like that, I have my proper data set. Now, the reason that unpivoting across tab table is so important is because once you have a proper data set, you're allowed to use Excel's data analysis features like sort, filter, pivot tables, and so on. If our goal was to first sort by units, then by product, we can now do that because we have a proper data set. I'm going to say sort largest to smallest. Then I'm going to sort product A to Z. And just like that, I have exactly what I want. That's example 2 for Power Query, transforming into a proper data set. Now let's go over to PQ3. Now we have 2 amazing goals in this example here. The first is we'll use Power Query to import multiple text files with over 1 million rows of data, and we'll transform those text files into a single table. And then, because we have too much data to put into the Excel sheet, we'll get to see Power Pivot for the first time. Now, Power Pivot, that's the name of the feature in Excel that allows us to import millions of rows of data. And here's the thing. Behind the scenes, there's something called a data model. Now, you can think of the data model using this picture here. Here's Excel with all its sheets, and Power Query is in Excel, and Power Query can load data to the data model. Now, we already saw how Power Query can load data to an Excel sheet, but in this case, it's going to load it to the data model. Now, Excel has Power Pivot, and Power Pivot does a bunch of things, but what we're going to use it for is it will be the window that shows us the tables that are stored in the data model. Now, the data model is a super efficient database to hold big data. Now, when we're in Excel, Power Pivot window is going to be sitting there as one of our ribbon tabs. But as soon as we load our data to the data model, something magic happens. A super efficient database actually opens behind the scenes. Now, we're going to call it the data model, but there's lots of synonyms for this data model. A columnar database, X velocity engine, all sorts of other names too. But we're going to simply call it the data model. So as soon as we load data to the data model, the super efficient database opens up and holds our big data. And we can access all of the tables that we put in the data model through Power Pivot, and we can make pivot table reports from those tables in the data model. Now, I want to go look at the text files. I'm going to go over to Windows Explorer. One of the items you can download is the zip folder, and when you unzip it, this is what it looks like. I'm going to double click. There's a single text file for the year 2017 here, but then there's this first folder. And if I double click and open it, it has data for the year 2015 and 2016. Now I'm going to double click one of these text files and open it to look at it. Now, text files have been around for a long time. It's how we get data from one system to another. Many databases and data storage systems cannot talk with each other. They cannot send data back and forth. So decades ago, they invented a number of file formats that are actually text files that keep our columns of data that make up our table in a text file, and we can export it from one system and import it to another. So here we have date, sales rep, product, and revenue. Now, it doesn't look pretty when it's in the text file, but it will come out looking just like a proper data set. So I'm going to close this. We have data for 2015 and 16. And the amazing thing is, I'm going to click the back button. We're going to tell Power Query to look at this folder. And Power Query will import any file in that folder. Then the beauty of it is, later when we get data from a later period or more data, we simply put the file in there. And when we refresh our pivot table and Power Query, everything will update with the new data. Now, I actually want to double click and open this. We are smart. We keep only text files in our folder. But that doesn't always happen. So I actually want to mistakenly put an Excel file in here. I'm going to right-click New, down to Microsoft Excel Worksheet, and I'm going to name this Data and Enter. I just want a file that's not supposed to be in here to be in here, because Power Query makes it super easy to filter out any files that shouldn't be imported. All right, I'm going to click the back button. And back again. There's our two folders. Now we go back over to our Excel workbook. Now we're going to import all that text data into the data model. And we're going to import a second table also. Here is our lookup table, where we have to look up the managers that are in our text sales table and find the region. So actually, we'll have two tables in the data model, and there'll be two tables in our pivot table field list. And we'll be able to drag region from one table and sales from another table, and our pivot table will work perfectly. I'm going to go back over to PQ3. That's our end result. We're trying to create a simple regional sales report. But because the data is all over the place and our sales table doesn't have a region column, we're going to use Power Query and Power Pivot Data Model to make it all happen. All right, it doesn't matter which sheet we're on. We're going up to Data, over to Get and Transform, over to Get Data. And they're all grayed out because I have this selected. I'm going to click in a cell. Get Data. Now, we have multiple files, so we're going to use From File. And we don't want just a single text file. We want to point Power Query to From Folder. So I click on that. It's going to ask us where that folder is. We click the Browse button. Browse to wherever the first folder is. If you click on the top one, it will obey you. It'll import everything in that folder and in this one. But we want to point to just first. Remember, two text files and an Excel file. Now I click OK. Now I click OK. And this step may be different in the other version of Excel. Whichever version you're in, we are going to click Edit. So I'm going to click Edit. Now, because we pointed Power Query to a folder, of course, it's going to find all the files and import data about the files, like the file name, extension, when it was accessed, when it was modified, and so on. Now, the actual data files are over here. I want to click not on the word binary, but off to the side in the light green. Oh, look, there's a little preview off to the side, little preview off to the side. That's not a file we want. Now, here's the amazing thing. We can come to the extension column and use our filtering skills that we learned in Excel to filter out any extensions that we don't want. Now, something about Power Query that is not true about Excel or even Power Pivot. Power Query is case sensitive. So if I use the filter and I choose .txt, all lowercase, and later we get a text file that is uppercase .txt, Power Query wouldn't understand. So here's what you do on a column like this. We want to convert everything to lowercase. Now, right here, everything already is lowercase, but we're building in a precaution for the future. With the column selected, we can go over to Transform, over to Text Column, and Format lowercase, or we can simply right-click down to Transform and lowercase. We didn't see anything happen, but it's a precaution for the future. Now, watch this. We can simply come and use our filtering skills. I'm going to uncheck .xlsx. And when I click OK, that's filtered out. So later, when we have other types of files or more text files, Power Query will remember to only import lowercase .txt. Now, all of these columns we don't need. The only one we need is content. So I click, and now I right-click. Please remove other columns. All right, now we're good to go. I want to come and name this first. I should have named this right off the bat. This is going to be our final sales table. Final sales table, and enter. There's some steps already, but we still have more steps. Now, here's a big difference between the version we're using and the other version. Now, there's even some in-between versions, but you got to be aware. If we click this button right here, it may just immediately combine all of the files into a proper data set. If that's the case, you'll have to watch video number 3 for Highline Excel 2016 class, because I show you how to deal with that earlier version. But we're in the later version. Even most of the versions are updated. So watch what happens when I click this double downward pointing arrow. When I click it, the first thing it's going to do is ask what our delimiter is. Now, because there's multiple files, it's going to use the first file as an example file. Then it's going to base its decision for combining and creating our table based on the first 200 rows. We're sure that all of our text data is exactly the same, so those two settings are fine. Our file origin is fine also. You might have to change yours, but we want to select the delimiter. The delimiter is what separates the columns. Now, we have a text file that is tab delimited. That is a very common delimiter. Another very common one is comma. Now, once we set our delimiter, now we can click OK. And when I click OK, again, it's going to do something much different than the very early versions of Excel 2016. And this is what's different. There's a bunch of steps that it did for us. If you don't see all these steps and it went straight to a table, you are actually going to have some false records with field names from all of the files you tried to import. Now, for us, we only had 2 files. So down below, there would be one false record that listed date, sales rep, product, and revenue. The trick was in the earlier version, you had to use filter and load more and then filter out the one record that said product. But we don't have to worry about that anymore. What it did was it looked at the sample file. It actually built some code for us. Then it built a custom function that it can then invoke later for every single one of the text files in that folder. Now, if we click down on Final Sales Table, there's the final result. You can see over here it says invoke custom function, remove other columns, expand changed type. Now, we sort of don't need to worry about all of that because it did it all for us. It got date data type, text, and oops, I don't want revenue to be integer. Now, even though this did come with no pennies, I want to change the data type to currency. Now, when I change this to currency, it's going to be polite. It's saying, hey, do you want to replace the current or add a new step? If I click Add a New Step, it adds an extra step down here, which we don't need. Replace current will actually change the code it created automatically and replace it with our currency. So replace current. Now, that's pretty amazing. That is about 1.2 million rows that we took from text files and converted into a proper data set. Now, we very carefully want to come up, close and load to. If you select that one, there's too much data. It will try for a second to put it into an Excel sheet, but then it will give you an error message. So we have to click Close and Load To. And this is where we want not a table, because that tries to dump it in the sheet. We want only create a connection. And I love this. Add this to the data model. Now, here's a hot tip. Even if you only have 500,000 records or 250,000 records, those would fit in an Excel sheet. But if you add it to the data model, the file size is dramatically reduced. All right? Only create a connection. Add this to the data model. Be sure to check that. A few people in class today didn't check that. And click OK. You could see it over here. The query is trying to import and go through all those 1.2 million records. It looks like it totally worked. 1.16 million rows loaded. Now, it didn't load it into the sheet, so we have to either go over to Power Pivot and click on Manage Data Model, or they also have in the Data Ribbon tab, Manage Data Model. So I'm going to click this to go look at our imported data. And here it is. You could see down at the bottom it says we have about 1.2 million records. Now, this is our Power Pivot window. We're going to use it in this class, just in this example, to look at the two tables, and then we're going to see how to build a relationship between the two tables. Later in the class, we'll see how to build some DAX formulas. Now, this is a separate window that opens that is actually looking at that data model database. Now, we want to jump back to the Excel sheet. You can use your mouse in the taskbar. You could also use this button up here or simply use Alt-Tab because we have one other table we need to import. We need to import this table into the data model. Now, we're not going to use Power Query for this. We're just going to import it directly into Power Pivot Data Model. Now, Power Pivot Data Model will not accept this Excel data unless we convert it to an Excel table. So I'm going to Control-T and Enter. Alt-J-T-A. I'm going to name this table Manager, Region, and Enter. Now we can go up to the Power Pivot Ribbon tab. And there's a huge button. Add this to the data model. Now you have to be sure and have your cursor inside the Excel table and click Add to Data Model. And look at that. We have our second table. Now, I want to go look at Final Sales Table. This table, and we can move the columns, but we don't need to. Notice it has sales rep, but we need to add up all of the revenue based on the region. Well, if we were in an Excel spreadsheet, what would we do? Well, we have sales rep, but no region column. What we would do, looking over at the Manager Region column, is this is a lookup table. We'd actually use VLOOKUP. Over here, we'd look up the sales rep name. We'd use this as our table. And we'd add a helper column with VLOOKUP. Well, we do not need to do that when we're using the data model. We get to use something called relationships. Now, I want to go back over here. This is a lookup table. And like lookup tables when we're doing exact match, there is a unique list of items in the first column. That way, when we build a relationship, the final sales table over here, we'll see the many side. That means we're allowed to have the sales rep name repeated many times. So Tamika Poe, many, many, many Topeka Poes, because Tamika made many sales. But if we had VLOOKUP, right, it would look this up many, many, many times. But because this is a lookup table and there's a unique list, it would always find Tamika and always return Southern Europe. Now, we don't need to use VLOOKUP. We're going to use a relationship. Now, this to us Excel people is called a lookup table. Sometimes you'll hear the term dimension table instead of lookup. But to us Excel people, this is a straight lookup table. Now, we're in the Home ribbon tab in the Power Pivot window. Over in the View group, we're going to click on Diagram View. And here's our two tables. There's our final sales table, and here's our lookup table or dimension table. Now, managers, that's the unique list of sales rep, and over here is sales rep. Now, it doesn't matter that they have different names. Watch what we're going to do. We're going to click and drag manager and drop it on top of sales rep. Instantly, we have a one-to-many relationship. Remember the first column over here, managers, unique list. There's exactly one of each. But of course, each manager can have many sales. Now, if you remember back to the prerequisite class, Business 216, we saw this type of one-to-many relationship in Access. But over here in Power Pivot, it's going to be amazing. We can simply drag manager to the pivot table and revenue, and it will work perfectly. Now, we're going to use this pivot table button in the Power Pivot window, and it doesn't matter which view you are in, data or diagram view. I'm going to go ahead and click that pivot table button. Now, it'll jump us back over to Excel because we're going to dump this data model pivot table on a new worksheet. I'm going to click OK. I'm immediately going to double click and call this. I called it DM for data model and then PT2 because this is the second pivot table on a sheet. Now, let's close queries and connections. And what's happening in the pivot table field list is we have lots of tables. Now, it's showing you all the possible tables in this Excel workbook and in the data model. Now, the way you know that these tables are from the data model is because it has a black bar at the top. That means they're from the data model. Now, I'd like to move just these two tables over to the active pivot table field list area. So I'm going to go back to all, and I'm going to right-click the first table and say Show in Active tab. Now I'm going to go to Manager, right-click, Show in Active tab. Now I want to go over to Active. That is amazing. Now I'm going to click and drag this over here just so we can get the full effect. Two different tables. This is the first time we've done this. I'm dragging the region down to rows. Region is from the Manager Region table. I'm dragging revenue down to values. And look at that. We are totally allowed to have our region column from one table and our revenue from another table. And notice, we didn't have to add number formatting. It got that from our Power Query when we added currency to that column. Now, we have one last thing we're going to do. We have the 2-year data. We have our report. And later, we'll make much more elaborate reports. This is just a simple report. But now we have the latest data. So we go back over to Windows Explorer. I'm going to double-click to open that. And I'm going to click on 2017 and copy. I'm going to leave it out here. Double-click first and Control-V to paste. Now, when we go back over and refresh, it will not take the Excel file, but because these are lowercase .txt, everything will update. Power Query, the data model, and our pivot table. Let's go back over to Excel. Now, we want to refresh this, but I want to go up to the Data Ribbon tab and click Queries and Connections. By the way, this button opens up our pane for queries, in our case, or connections. In the earlier version, this button was in Get and Transform and said Show Queries. I want to show that. And I'm going to grab the title bar and drag this over. And notice right here we have 1.16 million rows. But now we're going to try, and on the Data Ribbon tab, to refresh all, because we have to refresh Power Query, the Data Model, Alt-Tab, and the Pivot Table. Now, this doesn't always work. There's sometimes bugs in these new features that Microsoft adds. But we're going to try to click Refresh All so we can avoid refreshing the query and the pivot table in 2 steps. All right, I'm going to try this. I clicked Refresh All. Look at that. I can see it working over here. We see our pivot table original total with 2 years of 36 billion. And just like that, it did update. The refresh all worked. Our pivot table is updated. And look at that. The query's updated. I can see 1.6 million rows. And if I go over to the data model, down here I can see, sure enough, 1.6 million records in that data model. Alt-Tab. Now, if the Refresh All button didn't work, you simply have to come down here, right-click Refresh, and then do it a second time in the pivot table, right-click Refresh. Now, one other thing that happens sometimes, I have a sheet all the way at the end that I want to go look at. I'm going to come over to the Worksheet scroll arrows and right-click to expose my list of all the sheets. I'm going to scroll down, and at the very end, I want to click on Unhandled Error. Click OK. All right, I'm going to lodge this over on the right by dragging it. And we got to talk about this error that sometimes happens in Power Pivot. Unhandled exception has occurred in a component in your application. Now, yesterday in our lab at Highline College, we had this error. And Matt Allington, a Power Pivot expert, has this amazing article that describes this error. Now, the problem with this error is it can be caused by a bunch of different things, one of which is when you import an Excel table into the data model. Now, this article also describes a number of fixes, but this is the one fix that should always work. You have to disable the Power Pivot add-in, close Excel, turn off your PC, and then turn on the computer, open Excel, and re-enable the Power Pivot add-in. Now, that's crazy that Microsoft would produce Power Pivot and have this error like this. Now, as Matt Allington says in this article, why should we put up with all this trouble? Well, because Power Pivot is so useful. All right, now back over to, and I'm going to click on the sheet PQ. In this video, we saw an amazing introduction to Power Query and to Power Pivot. We saw over here on PQ, Get and Transform, our first example with Power Query is we took some bad data and used Power Query to clean it. Then we dumped our cleaned proper data set on a new sheet and created this pivot table. Then in Power Query example number 2, we saw how to use Power Query to transform a cross-tabulated table into a proper data set. Then in our third example, and watch this, I'm going to do it a different way. I'm going to, before I click on the right triangle, I'm going to hold Control and click. That jumps all the way to the end. In our third example, we actually started in Excel using Power Query to import text files that contained over 1 million rows of data. We loaded that through Power Pivot into the data model. The data model is the behind-the-scenes database that allows us to hold big data. Then we used Power Pivot to import an Excel table. We built a relationship, and the data model was complete. 2 tables and a relationship. And then what did we do? We built a pivot table based on the data model and dumped it back in Excel. And this was our pivot table, which we then added new data to that folder, refreshed everything, Power Query, the data model, and our pivot table, and everything updated. All right, that was a lot of fun with an introduction to Power Query and Power Pivot. If you like that video, click that thumbs up, leave a comment, and be sure to subscribe because there's always lots more videos from Excel is Fun. All right, we'll see you next video.